Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Another exciting chapter in MGMT203, this time scope management. Here's a quote that drives how project managers act. Be more concerned with your character than your reputation. Your character is what you really are, while your reputation is what others think you are. John Wooden. He has a lot of great quotes. Now, we're studying scope management this week. We're not using PMBOK Guide version 6. That's what this references. But the reason I use these slides with PMBOK Guide version 7 is because they provide still a lot of the meaty, ordered detail that I like to share. But we are focused on PMBOK Guide version 7. If you have any questions, note the reading assignment on Moodle for this week. I always list the keywords that I want you to focus on, and I've also provided a link to a PDF version of PMBOK Guide version 7 for you to use. So it's pretty easy to look up. These are some of the objectives for this week. This slide we've seen before, and though we don't really focus on the 5 process groups anymore, the concepts are the same. We'll start by initiating a project once the C-suite is done with their documents, their business case. After initiating, we'll do planning, executing, controlling, and closing. What I love about this slide is that as a project manager, these are all the things in planning that I want to pull into me to integrate, right? So all the yellow boxes are the things you're doing to bring the other processes to you. I also am fond of this slide, even though it's really a reference to PMBOK Guide version 6, because it breaks down by process group the things you should be focused on, and these are still valid in PMBOK Guide version 7. In initiating, I'm busy with the charter. In planning, I'm building out the knowledge areas and doing a kickoff. In executing, I'm managing people and building my deliverable and approving changes. In monitoring and controlling, I'm trying to control, I'm measuring the project and assessing it with the plan and identifying gaps and fixing them. And then, of course, closing. Now, a couple of key points to scope management right up front. We are going to do the work and only the work that is required. That is key. So I'd like to introduce 2 terms, which are part of what I ask you to look up. For example, in section 2.5 of PMBOK Guide version 7, there are product management considerations. So project scope, this is what we're used to by now. The project work to produce our deliverable. But what do I do with that deliverable when it's done? That is part of the product scope. So Tide with bleach is an example I've used before. Tide existed. Somebody said, hey, we need Tide with bleach. Great. They make a project. They build Tide with bleach. When Tide with bleach is done, it becomes a product that to this day is still produced and sold in stores. That is the product scope from the project to as long as that product is still being built or used in the factory. That's the product scope. And the project manager will want to consider the product scope as well as the project scope. Focus on the project scope, but consider the product scope. Notice to do this in scope management, we're going to build a work breakdown structure. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we do not allow gold plating. If it's not a real requirement, we don't want it. It wastes time and resources. Because remember, we want to do the work and only the work required to get this done. Now, these are the typical approach to building scope. We'll develop a plan to manage scope. We'll collect the requirements. We'll define the scope statement. Then we'll build a work breakdown structure. After that, there are 2 controlling processes. One is called validate scope, and that's where the customer gets to approve whether we've really met their intent. And control scope is for the project team itself internally to control the scope as we see it should be an output. There's a nice game. If you want to pause and play, you could email me and I will email you back the answers. Now, some key concepts. Before we begin any project, we want to identify, as we've discussed in weeks past, which developmental cycle we're going to choose, because there are very different approaches to adaptive requirements collection and predictive or waterfall project requirements collection. So just be aware of that, and you can pause and read this slide. Now, notice the definition of a requirement. A requirement is a condition or capability required to be present in a product, service, or result. Notice this is just the definition of a deliverable. So a requirement really could read a condition or capability required to be present in your deliverable. Okay, pretty interesting. Now, we're not focused on the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs, but I leave them here as starters for you intellectually as you're working your project. But notice we'll have two management plans in scope, which is very rare. We'll have the normal scope management plan, which is going to tell me how I'm going to produce my figure out my requirements and produce my deliverable. But then I'm going to have a requirements management plan, which is actually going to help me analyze, document, and prioritize my long list of requirements. These slides are just meant to be sample of things you would want in your scope management plan or your requirements management plan. I just put them there as examples because, to be honest, you're the project manager. You're going to build the methodology. You put in it what you need to be a successful project manager in terms of scope. Okay, those were just samples. Then I want to collect requirements. When I collect requirements, I notice that I'm going to determine and document what stakeholders need, right? Those stakeholders could be internal or external, not defining that, but it's what stakeholders need, okay? Some of those stakeholders will be government authorities, which have mandates, of course. Notice that requirements become the foundation of anything. If you don't identify a requirement now, early on, it will cost you big time later. A requirement that's really part of your project must be implemented. And if you find it out later, it will cost you more. It will delay your project. It will cause a lot of changes. So a requirement. Now I had the definition a couple slides earlier. I just want to expand it a little bit. Notice that a requirement is a deliverable. So that was what we pointed out in the last definition. Notice that a requirement is quantifiable, testable, and traceable to satisfy the stakeholder needs. Quantifiable, I can measure it. I can test it and make sure it works. So it's tied to quality management. It's traceable. I can track it from beginning to end. If it's a real requirement, I want to follow through and make sure it gets done. These are some ways that you may collect requirements. My favorites are expert judgment and brainstorming and interviews is how I do it, but there are lots of them. Here's the point. If over the course of the project, if you have changes like a new requirement, it will cost you more. Stakeholders' interest will rise. There will be a lot more changes, but the ease of which you can influence the update on the project decreases. Your influence over the project deliverable decreases over time. So you want to identify these things early. One of the ways that tools that you can use is called a requirements traceability matrix. It's great. Once I've identified a real requirement, I can trace it to the end. Notice a requirements traceability matrix, or RTM, connects the strategy to, which is at the business case level in week 1, to the deliverable, the output that we need. The requirements traceability matrix links those together. Now, a requirement also should be, according to these terms, your requirements to help you out should be unambiguous, traceable, complete, which means fully clarified, consistent, and acceptable to your key stakeholders. So that helps you further define what is a requirement. Here's how that requirements traceability matrix. Notice I'm not just putting down requirements in this column, but I'm putting why they're required. They were in the charter. They might be part of user acceptance validation, so the customer mandated it. Notice I'm aligning it with my business case. What is the business need? That's in the business case at the very start of this. And then later I'll tie these requirements to the work breakdown structure. So a key point from here is that the PMBOK guide emphasizes that good requirements lead to good deliverables. So it's critical to get this right up front. Now, some more inputs, tools, and techniques as I define scope. But the point is, when I define scope, I'm going to produce a scope statement, a narrative, 6, 7, 8 sentence paragraph, and it's going to describe to me what's in these bullets. Project justification, right? That comes from the business case. Project scope, product scope, right? What's going to be that long term once I turn it over? What's not in the project, as well as constraints and assumptions, and also acceptance criteria is critical. This slide is comparing scope in, or the iron triangle, the triple constraint in predictive or waterfall projects versus agile. Pause and reflect on that as you desire. The work breakdown structure is what I really wanted to get to here, because once I have a scope statement, I'll use the work breakdown structure to visualize it and create a hierarchy. So the bicycle, and this would really be a narrative paragraph form up here, this is where my scope statement goes. And so I want to build a bicycle, and then I'm going to build these, I'm going to put these boxes, the work breakdown structure level 2, things I need like wheels, and then work breakdown structure level 3, well, what kind of wheels? I need a front wheel and a rear wheel. And notice there's not a lot of detail here. So a work breakdown structure will go with each of these boxes to tell me who's the owner, when it's required, what parts I need, what quality standards, etc., etc. Here's a picture of that hierarchical work breakdown structure, and notice I put numbers to them in each of the WBS levels. Those are control accounts, and those let me track my costs and requirements up to the scope statement. Now, a hierarchy, I just want to point out, doesn't have to be boxes. It can be an Excel spreadsheet. And notice this is a hierarchy as it's labeled. That's really what I wanted to point out. Here is an Army example I used to use. Here's the scope statement up top. It's an Army move, base realignment, and closure commission work. And so here's level 2 and level 3. I'm just making it up. But the key is we decompose the scope statement from the top down to build these boxes. And the very lowest level of a work breakdown structure is the work package. That's when you know you're done. And of course, tie the WBS to your WBS dictionary. Okay, so now I have a WBS, I have a WBS dictionary, and I have a scope statement. That is my scope baseline. That's one of 3 baselines in project management, the others being schedule and cost. That forms the term we've come to know as the triple constraint, scope, schedule, and cost baselines. Okay, so now I have my scope baseline because I have my scope statement, my work breakdown structure, and my dictionary. Okay. The work in the WBS is done top down. This slide is worth pausing on. All I did was a summary of all things work breakdown structure related. Pretty easy to read. Just think about it. Pause and think about it. It's worth it. So now, as I said, I have my scope baseline. Yay. And so the last 2 parts of scope are controlling processes. One is to validate scope, and it formalizes acceptance by the customer. I actually take the deliverable to the customer at the end of each phase, and I ask them to review it themselves, do their own quality control, and sign off that we're on track, or we'll do change requests, right? So validate scope. If there's something wrong with my deliverable, say I missed something or they wanted to add something, I can do preventive action, corrective action, or defect repair. There are definitions there, the pretty good ones. Make sure you look it up in the PMBOK guide. I did also want to point out a connection that notice that here I am validating scope with the customer, but notice I'm doing internal to the project itself, quality control first. First in my team, I want to make sure it's right before I take it to the customer. So in my team, I'm checking the specifications or specs. Once I've done that, then I'll go to the customer and see if they verify it, and hopefully they will sign off on it. Now, a control is a typical control process, and it's about making sure I am in control of the processes along the way. This is kind of a summary of what we've talked about. Though we no longer use these processes in project management, I've listed them across the top and in the middle. And in this central part is what's going on when I plan scope, collect requirements, define scope, create my work breakdown structure, validate scope, and control scope. You'll notice some of the same things we just talked about summarized here. And my key outputs in each of those processes are here. That's all I have. That was fun, and I will see you online.